Okay, so this week I'm going to talk about Tempu Sensei, who was my other great spiritual teacher in Japan. And he had a tremendous influence on Aikido, most of which wasn't talked about because there was a sort of contradiction of having O-sensei as, the head of Aikido, and yet many Aikido, it's also studied with Tempu Sensei. But Japanese tend to like nice, clean hierarchies with one person at the top. And so for many Aikidoists, that was O-sensei. I'd met a number of his students while I was training at Hombu, and some of them mentioned Tempu Kai, and finally one of them sort of took me in hand and took me to my first Tempu lecture. And then I actually went to O-sensei and asked for his permission to join Tempu Kai. And some of my friends were amazed. They said, was in a tiny minority of people who actually asked O-sensei for permission. And he said okay, although I'm not sure he was totally delighted. But there was clearly tremendous mutual respect, but there was a certain amount of rivalry. They were after, often the same students. The best known was Koichi Tohei, who dedicated his book Aikido in Daily Life to Tempu Sensei, not to O-sensei, who named his key society Shin Shin Toitsu Aikido, which was stolen from Tempu Nakamura without permission, as I learned from Tempu Sensei's main teacher, which was translated as unification, Shin Shin, mind body or heart body. Toitsu is to unify, to make one, but more subtly, it's not merely unifying mind and body, which is the key society translation, but it's discovering the unity that's always existed between mind and body. It's very much like most mystical traditions. They say you don't have to build a soul, you already have one. We all have a spark of God within us. We don't have to make it from scratch. So it's a very positive sort of approach to spirituality. When I went to see Tempu Sensei, he lectured every month in Tokyo. And it was a 5-day lecture series. It was very interesting. The first 4 days were the basics of his thought, some discussion of his life and experiences, and the 5th day was different. It would rotate among half a dozen or more topics. So one month he would talk about the 12 ox herding pictures from Zen Buddhism. Another month he would talk about the relation between his thought and atomic and subatomic physics. Other times it was more connected with biology and medicine. And he was the embodiment, as O-sensei was the embodiment of Aikido. He really was the embodiment of his own system. Let's take the next slide. And this is a picture of Tempu Sensei demonstrating Iai. And I had never seen before that time or ever after anybody draw a sword the way he did. I mean, it felt like he had a gimmick sheath, and he would push a little button, and sort of like a switchblade knife, the whole katana would leap out of the saya, the scabbard, into his hand. That's what it looked like. He drew it, but he drew it so quickly and so smoothly, it really looked like something else did it, not him. So he lived from 1876 to 1968. I think he was more than 92. I think he was actually 94. But in Japan, it's tricky to figure age, so I would go for 94. His father had been the senior samurai in one of the great clans. They lived in, I think it's Kagoshima, and I think that's in Kyushu, isn't it? Yeah. But when the shogun was overthrown and the emperor restored, the family moved to Edo. It wasn't Tokyo yet. And his father became the director of the Ministry of Finance, which is one of the most powerful positions in the country. And in fact, he introduced paper money to Japan. And that was a fairly significant, can you imagine? Japan was still living 2 centuries or more behind the West. And his father, really pioneered in bringing Japan into the modern age. And then later on, so did Tempu Sensei himself. As a leading samurai family, he was trained in his family's own style of judo, also in his clan's version of kenjutsu and iaijutsu. And often in those days, martial arts were limited to clan members. So that the clan members would have effective, powerful arts in case of war. And there were very few dojos in the cities that were open to everybody. And as you remember, O-sensei did not open Aikido to everybody until after World War II. And then for years, you needed 2 letters of recommendation from people known to somebody at Hombu Dojo. And this is a little bit about Tempu Sensei. As I said, his experiences were so powerful. I mean, he really lived what he talked about. He joined the Japanese Imperial Army at 16, which I hadn't known before. And he became a military intelligence agent for 2 years in northern China. He and a small group of his colleagues observed Russian troop movements behind Russian lines and transmitted them back to the Japanese army. He said, all that time, I never slept in a bed. I never had a pillow. When I drank, I would kneel and scoop up water with one hand, keeping my other hand free. I lived in constant awareness that I could be shot or captured any moment. He said, you have no idea the pressure we were all. He had some extraordinary adventures in China, and I'll just tell you one of them because I think it's very relevant to us. His group did very well, and the military intelligence command sent another relatively young Japanese, I think he was about 27. They were all, Tempu was 16, by then maybe 17. And this man was known as a brilliant swordsman, and he won, lots of medals and tournaments in Japan. And Tempu said they were in an area that had lots of Mongolian bandits. It was lawless. And the bandits used a sort of a heavy halberd, like a naginata, but the blade was probably twice as heavy. And they would swing it around their heads, and it would make a horrible whirling noise, which scared the hell out of half-trained militia and peasants and merchants. And so they would come in shouting and whirling their weapons around their head. And Tempu knew, they'd encountered them before, that if you stayed calm and focused, they would retreat. If you just kept your kamae, and if you did anything, you went right for where the hands were. So he said, well, why don't you show us, how your sword art works? And they all sort of stepped back as 3 or 4 bandits sort of kept advancing, swinging their weapons around. And Tempu said he was fascinated because what happened was this great swordsman sort of started crouching and crouched lower and lower and not moving. He said, wow, this must be a secret stance in his sword style, you know, a life and death technique. And then it was clear that he couldn't move. He was actually scared to death. So Tempo and the others just, you know, ran at the bandits, and the bandits ran away. And he said, I had never seen a weapon like that. I had no idea what to do. You know, against a sword or a regular Japanese spear, I'm fine. But I couldn't, you know, I had no idea how to handle them. And what Tempu said when he told that story was that's the difference between training in a dojo and training in real life. That there's something fundamentally artificial about dojo training. And it's very different from real life applications of martial arts. And quite a number of other people have said exactly the same thing, you know, unless you've actually fought, not just like a judo tournament or a karate tournament, but real fighting, you know, probably more realistic than the MMA, but actual fighting really tests your skill. So after 2 years, and he was one of very, very few military intelligence agents that returned to Japan. He came down with a severe attack of tuberculosis. And he used to joke and say, we were under such pressure, I had no time for tuberculosis when I was in China. But when I got back, I got, you know, I relaxed a little bit and I got incredibly ill. And he traveled to the United States. He first met with a man who wrote you know, one of those early positive thinking books before Norman Vincent Peale. And he came to meet him and said, look, I'm suffering. I may die from this. I read your book and I think it's fascinating. What can you recommend? And the man said, you read my book? Well, but did you memorize it? And he said, well, no. He said, well, you go memorize it before you come back here. And Tempu decided to find another teacher because he didn't think memorizing this guy's book. It was in English, but still not his native language. By the way, his high school education was all in English. Again, this was a kind of a wealthy international family he came from. He spoke fairly fluent English, loved Shakespeare, by the way, and fluent Chinese, learned German, and he would also learn some Russian in order to be an intelligence agent. His Chinese, I gather, was good enough for him to pass as Chinese. And in fact, he said, well, we had for a year or two while I was growing up, this Chinese politician or Chinese statesman who lived with us named Sun Yat-sen, you know, the sort of first great revolutionary in modern China. So he had quite an extraordinary background. And when he came to the West, he studied at Columbia University. He joked, he said, well, I finished the medical course in 2 years, but, you know, it was very short. We didn't know much back then. You know, this was something like, you know, 1912 or probably before, maybe before World War I. And he went on, studied in England, in Europe, and he got sicker and sicker. He decided to go back to Japan and at least see his family once more before he died. So he got on a ship, could hardly breathe. And there was a man on the ship who was dark-skinned, Indian, who was going from England back to his ashram in India. And it turned out he was an internationally famous yogi. And he motioned Tempu over to him. They were sitting in the dining room, I think, of the ship. And he said, well, you've given up, haven't you? And here Tempu had, traveled around the world to find a cure. And he said, I've done this. He said, will you try one more thing? And Tempu said, well, yes, then come with me. And later the guru said, Tempu said, well, how come you took me on? He said, well, because you were willing to come with a man you'd never met. And put your faith in what studying with me might bring. And for 2 years, he meditated. He eventually did solitary meditation in an isolated cave. And his tuberculosis was cured in part by breathing exercises and in part because those breathing exercises were at a very high altitude. The mountain was Kanchenjunga in Nepal, which is where his teacher's ashram was. So again, he said, yoga in those days is nothing like today. He said, a traditional teacher of yoga never gave any answers. What they would do would give you like a koan. They would tell you, at one point his teacher said, well, can you sit still? And Tempu said, yes, I learned to do that. I was trained. And he said, oh, good. Tonight, I want you to find the most comfortable position and sit absolutely still all night, meditating on the moon. So Tempu put his back against a tree and sort of crossed his legs, not in a full lotus, but in a sort of quarter lotus. And of course, it was incredibly difficult. It was very painful. He sat through lots of waves of pain. But he's very proud of himself. He didn't move. He didn't change his leg position, nothing. The next morning, the teacher brought him in, and he said, well, did you sit without moving? He said, yes, master. He said, okay, describe the moon. And Tempu said, oh, my God. I was so busy not moving, I forgot to look at the moon. And that, he said, was a lesson that always stayed with him, that we get so distracted by, what we're in the middle of that we forget to do what we should do or promise to do. Now, these are two pictures of Tempu Sensei. The one on the left, he's got two of his pictures that he loved. I have one of them on my wall. If I can, that's probably too dark. There, you can sort of see it in the back corner. I also have a scroll with it's a picture of Bodhidharma, the monk who introduced Zen practice to China. And the other one is a beautiful picture of Mount Fuji. And he did many of them for his students. So he was really a marvelous artist. He wrote poetry, aphorisms, books of philosophy and science. I love this picture of him. This is probably the Shinkansen train. He loved new gadgets. And, he looked like sort of a prince in disguise when he walked around Tokyo. I went with him to one of the largest department stores in Japan. He wanted to give me a present. And when we walked in, the manager of the store rushed up and almost did a kneeling bow to him. Turns out that the owner of the store was one of his students, as well as the manager. So he went in like he owned the store. And that's how he was. I mean, wherever he went, he was more than at home. Notice how big his ears are. He used to joke that's supposed to be a sign of the Buddha. So he's kind of proud of that. And the fact that he looked 30 years younger than his real age. Next slide. Now, I want to talk about his approach to centering. It's interesting because Koichi Tohei oversimplified what Tempu taught, and he thought he knew best, which frankly wasn't true. But I learned this from Tempu and practiced it ever since I started training with Tempu in about 1965. Um, and what Tempu Sensei taught was the way you center yourself is you do three things simultaneously. You relax your shoulders, you lightly tighten your belly muscles, you settle in hara, that is, and you lightly tighten your buttocks. And let me go through. The way you relax your shoulders is like you would cut with a sword. You don't go 1, 2. You don't go down. There's no gap. It's really 1. So the raising is half. It's like this, 1. So you just a little bit of raise and then drop. And as you drop, as you're dropping, you feel your hara and you slightly tighten your buttocks. A simple, let's just do that together. Let's do the raising and lowering. So it's a half raise, ready, raise and drop. The other thing he would have us do is do a double breath with it, because he claimed that a double breath moves far more air in the lungs than just a single breath. So it'd be like this. Not sure you can hear that, but that's the breath integrated with this. And what he taught was you practice how do you practice tightening your abdominal muscles? Everybody overdoes it. He said, make a fist, bring your fist as though you're going to punch yourself in the abdomen without touching. And you can feel yourself automatically, the muscles not tighten so much as they come alive. So try that too. And just notice how your body responds to that fist, even though you know you're not going to punch yourself. Those muscles do come alive. And the third one is the least known, is you tighten your buttocks, or he said, the way he learned it was you tighten your anal sphincter. Sphincter muscles are circular or oval, so by tightening your buttocks, you close that sphincter. And what Tempu said is if you leave the sphincter open, it's almost as though he escapes out your butt. He didn't put it that way. He was much better raised than me. But you do this, and it balances, because if you just focus forward on your abdomen, it throws you slightly forward. So this way you balance forward and back. And really, some old definitions of hara say hara includes your abdomen, your hips, and the small of your back. It's the whole center of your body. So you drop, and the center of your body comes together. So let's just try all three at once. Again. And you still don't know how to do it. You'll have to practice it at least 1,000 times, as we know. This is just a hint about, what we should do or could do. Any questions? Again, Tempu Tohei made these 4 rules. Relax completely. Well, nobody can relax completely. And really, it's focus on the shoulders, because that's where the tension throws us off balance the most. Keep one point I've never liked, as though there's a single hidden point in there somewhere. So it's really just awaken your hara, awaken your abdomen. And then the third one, Tohei never mentioned at all, which is tightening the buttock. So that's the practice of centering, and I found it incredibly valuable, something you can practice every day. It works emotionally, it works for focus of concentration, it works to bring out your the energy you've got when you're feeling tired. It's a very, very helpful practice. Um, Originally in India, Tempu Sensei said this was known as kumbhaka, um, which is the pause between the breaths. So you when you after an in breath, you settle.
I just gonna just sit wait there. Oh, can I
Let me,
finish?
may I finish, please? I'm not done. So you breathe in and then drop your, drop into center, do these three things after you've breathed in, and then you breathe out. And if you can fit it in, you drop into your hara again after breathing out. So it's that space between breaths. Now, question? Was there a question, or was someone's kid just kibitzing? Let's have the next slide. And one of the important things in Tempu's practice, and they often call it Japanese yoga, which was just out of absolute ignorance. Well, Tempu taught a combination of Raja Yoga, which was a focus on a certain kind or certain kinds of meditation, and also Karma Yoga, which is practicing in daily life. And Aikido in daily life, which was Tohei's second book, again, was stolen from Tempu Sensei. So centering, he said, when you walk, practice centering as you're walking. Climb stairs instead of taking the elevator. And with each step, you can center, drop into center. It's a natural place. One of the, a nice metaphor is like clearing a calculator. You know, you do a calculation and you don't leave the old sum on your calculator. When you do the next calculation, it'll throw everything off. So it's like centering is clearing your body, clearing your mind from whatever you've been doing. And I think one of the clearest examples of that is when gymnasts finish, before doing a routine, they settle, they center. When after they do the routine, they say they have to stick the landing, which is they have to come down balanced, symmetrical. And I think they're both very clear examples of centering. Next slide. So I mentioned Tempu was a wonderful artist. The large character is Chikara, or strength or power. The underneath it is Tempu's signature as an artist. And if you look very carefully, he's actually put Tempu, the two characters, together. And it starts out, it's really like a chant. I am power is the first line. And we used to chant it. We used to do jogging around the Buddhist temple where we did summer practices. And we used to chant this instead of getting tired. And it was amazing to see groups, some with grandfathers and others with grandmothers and some with young kids. And everybody would be sort of chanting this as we ran around. He gave he made one of these and then they were duplicated, and all new members who came to the summer training practice received this as a copy. But anybody who had been to at least one summer practice could request a copy. So people would request like the Bodhidharma picture that I showed earlier, or the Mount Fuji picture. He did a beautiful enso, a beautiful perfect circle, often with a character in the middle. He was really and he did all of that while teaching full time. Somehow he fit in, he would do 500 original drawings while the rest of us rested between his lectures and demonstrations. And this is Shin Toitsu. I can't read the character on the right exactly. Um, is that Shin Shin together? I think it. You can't tell either. I found over and over again in Japan, some connoisseurs would say, "Wow, that's just gorgeous calligraphy. I wish I could read it." But I think that's what Tempo often did, which is what he did for his name. He would he would simply run one character into the other one. So that's actually the large character on the right. I think is two characters combined. Um, this was a very important notion of Tempu's, that one way to come to um, our own capacities is to discover this unity which is within us. Um, and I think it's a very bad translation to say to unify mind and body, but to really discover the unity that's always been there. Next slide. These are two lovely pictures of Tempu. This is, I think, well, I think he's at home and I think he's doing calligraphy on the left. He's a little bit younger here. And I love this picture of him with the sword. There's a light in his eyes and in his face because he was a master swordsman. So that's just, we all loved him. I mean, I had friends who were college students whose parents had been his students, in some cases grandparents, but the kids who were my age grew up with these teachings. I mean, that's, they wouldn't go to the lectures when they were younger, but even at very young ages, they would go to the week to 10-day long summer practices. We'd meditate and run and do all kinds of interesting things. And by the way, he was the one who introduced the unbending arm as an example of the power of unifying your mind and body. That any doubt in your ability to resist is what gets in the way, and it wasn't just a mechanical sort of, I squirt my key out like a fire hose, but it was much more a demonstration of a very important point in his teachings. Okay, next. Oh, by the way, one reason his little finger of his right hand, middle finger, is sticking out, he's not giving the finger to the photographer. I'm sure Shino is sensitive to people doing that. He would demonstrate, he would hold a sword in his hand and have people wrap a rope or a sash or something around his hand, pull it tight, and then draw the sword out without cutting himself. But after doing that, God knows how many hundreds of times, eventually he cut himself. And so that finger did not work as well as it should have. But he tried all kinds of things. On his way back from India, he went to wherever the nearest port was, I don't remember, and he saw the Indian fakirs, the magicians, lie on bed of nails and walk on fire and walk on broken glass. And he walked up to him and said, "Well, show me how you do that. That's interesting." And the man said, "You're the only one I've ever heard ask that question. Everybody thinks that we're superhuman." He said, "Look, you have the same skin as I do. If your skin can lie on a bed of nails or walk over broken glasses, so can mine. So show me how you do it." And early years of those summer practices, he had people not only walk on broken glass, but he would set up a ladder of samurai swords, sharp samurai swords, with the blade up, and people would climb up the ladder of those blades. It would have scared me to death. Thank God I came late. When I was there, he would put needles in our arms, everybody who hadn't had it before, and then he would pull it out. And a few cases, there was a droplet of blood, and he would go, and it would stop. So what I think is helpful, not that we all need to practice in detail, But this is what many Aikidoists, the estimate was half the senior Aikidoists when they were training, when they were uchideshi or training every day all day long, they became Tempu Sensei students because they couldn't understand those sensei's language. And not only was it esoteric Shinto, but he actually grew up in an area where growing up he learned esoteric Buddhism, I think in Mikyo. And so there are these two esoteric systems that intermingled. And Tempu began to put things in ways that modern Japanese could understand. And so for many of them, it was a great supplement. Tempu made an interesting distinction between daily life and survival or existence. So seikatsu simply means, your daily life. You go shopping for food, you make dinner, you get wrapped up in your daily routine. Seizon is if you're very ill, if God forbid you're in the hospital, you're worrying about surviving. And Tempu said part of the problem is people don't think about what keeps us healthy, what keeps us alive. We get wrapped up in everyday life. And he said and he distinguished between the mental and physical aspects of practice. So for daily life, he said, learn to concentrate, learn to focus your mind. That a healthy mind should be like a clear lake and clearly reflect the world around you. And physically, to keep practicing and to keep increasing the physical work that you do so that you increase your capacity. From the point of view of survival, he said that by far the most important thing is developing a positive mind. He taught that 50 years before, the whole fad or popularity of psychoneuroimmunology, where they demonstrated that, in fact, your mental attitude affects your physical health and your physical strength. And for the physical side, he said we need to know our own bodies. He experimented with his own diet, and he said, as I got older, I needed less protein. I needed less meat. Learn to practice centering, so it's a natural part of your practice. And he was funny. He said, people today take so little responsibility for their health. They go see their doctor, and the first thing they say is, "Doctor, how am I?" Well, you should be able to tell your doctor how you are. It's your body. He also kept saying, your mind is so much more important. Only take medicine when absolutely necessary. And many of his students would drive their doctors crazy. They would be hospitalized, and the first thing they would say is, no sleep medication, no pain medication. I'll handle it. And they, over and over again, the nurses or the doctors on duty would have to call their physician to get an okay not to give them more medication. And as Tempu would joke, he said, people in a hospital, they'll wake you up to give you sleeping medication. Absolutely makes no sense at all. So, next slide. So, moving on to this notion of concentration. Again, when our minds are clear, when our minds are concentrated, we can see whatever's around us and remember it clearly. And he said the opposite of that kind of concentration, Tempu called, you get absorbed in something where you can't hear or see anything else, but maybe more commonly is attachment. I want that. And as soon as you get attached to something, again, we get tunnel vision. And so our attention is pulled by the object rather than directed. So the simple diagram he did, he said, concentration, you direct your attention to what's around you consciously. attachment, it's sort of, oh, look at that. Without realizing it, you've suddenly inclined your body and been sort of pulled to focus on one thing. So Tempu expected us to be able to remember what we saw. And he would tell stories. For example, he would drive through Tokyo and he would ask one of his old students, did you notice the store selling bamboo? He said, we just drove for an hour. And he recounted exactly where there was a lumber store that had bamboo. He said, didn't your eyes see it? He said, well, I guess I was distracted. But he had an extraordinary ability to concentrate. And he would pull little tricks, like tell people what money they had in their pocket, which went beyond what we think of as normal concentration. But it came from practicing clarity and stillness of mind. I really love this picture of him. That was the age, early 90s, that I knew him. I studied with him for roughly over a year and a half, maybe almost 2 years, when I first lived in Tokyo. And I went back to the States. I'd finished my research for my doctoral dissertation, and I wasn't sure whether I'd be coming or when I'd be going back to Japan. And finally, my dissertation chair, who was Stanley Milgram, who was both infamous and very famous at the time, said, I did this research also for my dissertation, and you've got some fascinating findings, and I think I can get a grant for you to go back and continue your research as a postdoctoral researcher. And I'll come along, I'll make a trip to Japan and oversee some of the trials. And so he very quickly put together a proposal. And as soon as I heard yes, I wrote a letter to Tempu Sensei, airmailed it. And his son-in-law, who I was quite friendly with and who lived with him, said he brought the letter to Tempu Sensei. His English was excellent, so he often translated English for Tempu Sensei. And Tempu Sensei said, oh, it's from Bob. He's coming back, before the letter was opened. So he knew more than he should have, or more than we expected. Next. Now, here is an interesting approach to learning to concentrate. He said, the more you get distracted, the more you're like throwing rocks into the lake, it doesn't get still. So Tempu taught, avoid these 4 situations, because that's where we make a habit of not concentrating, not having a clear mind. Number 1 is when you're in a hurry. And how many times have we all raced out of the house because we're late and had to race back to get our briefcase or our keys or, worst case, our pants? Your mind is already going into the future, so you weren't paying attention in the present. And, the more we practice that, the worse the habits we develop. And I learned from, actually, it was Feldenkrais who taught many of the same things Tempu did. Feldenkrais said, look, don't be in a hurry, just work quickly. Don't rush. Never rush, because rushing means your mind is all unclear and not focused. Number 2, when you think you're doing something that's uninteresting, which is when we try to do 3 other things. Let's listen to music, watch a TV program, have a conversation. And what we're doing is learning to not concentrate very well. And those of us with kids know our kids are masters at this. But it's a habit to overcome, frankly. And what Tempu said is, there's no interest or non-interest in what you're doing in the job. It's all in your attitude toward it. if it's important enough for you to do, you ought to figure out why it's important and treat it that way. So that whatever we're doing, we focus on it while we're doing it. A related one is when you think your work is valueless. And it was interesting because one of his main teachers was a very gifted psychiatrist. And he said, when I was in medical school, I worked to help put my way through medical school. And I ended up 1 year doing in a laboratory that was working on feces. And he said, talk about uninteresting or valueless work. I was cutting up feces and, testing them for pH and whatever, and it smelled awful. And he said, but I started to look finally for what was the value, and I realized how much you can learn from urine or feces or, all kinds of things that we don't value, that we don't think are important in the body. So find the value, he said. And then habit. And of course, the ideal is the Zen goal of doing everything with beginner's mind. To realize that when we let habit take over, our minds are somehow wandering off, not focused on what we're doing. And I've certainly had the experience of, working 5 days a week very hard, and then having a 3-day weekend, and Monday getting in the car and starting to drive to the university, because that's what I did every Monday. I had to turn around after a couple of blocks and go back home. William James, in his book Psychology, 2 volumes, had a whole chapter on habit. And one of the things he said is he heard the story of a man who was going out to dinner. He's going out to a formal dinner party. So he laid his tuxedo out in his bedroom. He had I forget what the right term is, a little wooden butler, where you can hang your clothes on them so they don't get all wrinkled. So he went in, he was a little tired. He took off his jacket, he took off his shirt and pants. He put on his pajamas and went to bed and slept through the dinner. But that was the power of habit, because habits chain. One movement leads to another. And whenever he took off his clothing, he put on his pajamas and went to bed. That was the habit he had. But he was certainly completely unconscious of what he was doing. Can you imagine that? How do you make up that excuse? Next slide. 2 more pictures of Tempu. This is how he taught us to meditate. It's only one of many mudras where you bring the index fingers together, thumbs over them. And the interesting thing is, if you try that for a period of time, if you get sleepy, the thumbs will not make contact anymore. They'll sort of slip off. So it's a nice biofeedback practice. And I like this close-in picture. He was very kind, but you can tell he was also incredibly intelligent, had a very strong will. At one point, he said, well, I can teach you what I learned from my Kung Fu teacher, which I used in China, which is a blow that kills with 1 strike. And they said, well, that age is past. No, I won't teach you. But he also carried a telescoping club with him whenever he went out of the house, because he said, I would feel naked if I didn't carry a weapon. I've done it all my life. Next slide. And one of the interesting things that Tempu taught is how important a positive mind is. Again, before psychoneuroimmunology. And I've taught this for years to business people from a slightly more modern, updated perspective, but integrating Tempu Sensei's stuff with it. He said, first of all, become more aware of the negative messages that are around you, negative suggestions. I mean, when we turn on the news, for example, it was all the killing of George Floyd and the COVID virus. It was all about death and violence, and you couldn't find anything else on the news channel. So realize that the most clear example of suggestion is hypnosis, and we're given sort of hypnotic suggestions all the time. And if we're one teacher once said, and if you listen to a negative suggestion, you say, well, that's reasonable. Oh, yeah, you might die if you get COVID-19 and the odds are very high. That's a reasonable suggestion. He said, whenever you think something is reasonable, you sort of let it take root in your subconscious. And he said, don't. Realize that it's not necessarily true if you're doing, your own physical and mental practice. Second one is to reduce self-criticism. And I think the book, The Inner Game of Tennis, and all its brothers and sisters in a game of golf and a game of everything else, really describes brilliantly how we criticize ourselves. If you miss a serve, you don't go, well, I'll improve it next time. You go, damn it, don't you know better than that? And tend to say things to ourselves that we wouldn't tell our best friends. So really it's a habit, and many of us grew up with that as a habit that we just thought was normal. And maybe our parents were examples of it, or our friends, or whatever. It really does weaken our ability to be positive, to be healthy, to be successful. In communicating with other people, shift from criticism to being positive. And the old idea that if you can't say anything nice, shut up, is not a bad idea. Because when we're criticizing someone else, in a way, our own mind is taking in that negativity also. And it's funny, some people think it's sophisticated to be critical, but it really is very, very negative. And if you haven't read The Inner Game of Tennis or any of the other Inner Game books, I really recommend it. I mean, the guy who wrote it, whose name I can't remember, was a tennis pro. And he also took up yoga and became part of a very famous yoga community. So he included his meditative practice and his guru's teachings, and still taught tennis, and found they worked very well together. Avoid worry and anxiety. Tempu said, worry about the past doesn't do a lot of good since it's over. Anxiety about the future doesn't do any good because it's not here yet. Oh, Tim Galway, right. Remain centered in the present. And remain centered in the present, focused on what you're doing. And again, the whole notion of success in golf or tennis or almost anything we do is to remain focused in the present without judging, because that judging screws up our performance. And some people are so self-critical that the tiniest error takes them over. I think I told you the story about one man who I taught this course to, and he was amazingly successful. He had a wonderful family who loved him. He was founded his own company. He was very successful, and he was a magnificent violinist. He was so good that he got to play a violin concerto with the Minneapolis Symphony. And at the end, the whole symphony orchestra stood. Everybody in the audience stood. They gave him a standing ovation. And his wife very privately told me, and he was miserable and depressed for weeks afterwards because one note was wrong, he felt. So again, that tendency to beat ourselves up really is horribly destructive. Positive language. And Tempu said we can often put something positive. For example, instead of saying, I'm exhausted, and if you try jogging and saying, I'm exhausted in the middle of your run, you'll see what happens. Your run will pretty much stop at that point. But if you say, well, I'd really like to rest, the implication of that is, but I don't have to. You can acknowledge that, you know, you'd like to rest, that you've done a lot of running, but without putting it in a way that suggests you have to, that you can't go on. And the last one I found very, very useful. Tempu argued that every human being has a conscience. And in developing a positive mind, you can't lie, cheat, and steal the way some people do. I mean, there are some people who are pathological liars. There are some people who are pathological cheats. And we have something in us, you know, in Christianity it's called a conscience. It has other names in other religions that expects honesty of us. And we can't think well of ourselves if we behave badly. And I have some examples, but we're just about out of time. But it's a wonderful thing to teach, and I think it's something we could teach our kids in our kids classes. You know, that it would be a great idea for them to learn to be honest as part of their Aikido practice. Next slide. And I could save this. Why don't I save this till next week? Because it's actually a brilliant idea that Tempu came up with, which is never go to bed feeling depressed or angry or negative. That the moment before going to sleep sets up sort of an emotional tone and either positive or negative thoughts throughout our sleep cycle. And Tempu figured that out. He did a lot of self-observation, and I found there are other people who have done the same, saying the same thing. So I'll save that till next week. And any questions? Talked about his training in both Aikido and Tempu Sensei's ideas, but it was very hard to talk about these things while O Sensei was alive. And frankly, Tohei Sensei was brave to do it, although not very diplomatic. But it, in one sense, it was a different system. And not every Aikidoist was willing to look beyond O Sensei and his teaching. But some were, and I think you can see how what Tempu did was really create a modern system out of his experiences, which weren't really terribly modern. After all, Russo-Japanese War, studying in India, back in 1910 or whatever. Oh, and on the way back to Japan, he did stop in China and visited Sun Yat-sen and helped with the Chinese Revolution. And came back with a large grant from Sun Yat-sen's government, which he invested in starting businesses. So, I mean, I could go on and on. By the way I learned this stuff was every month I would go to the 5 lectures that Tempu Sensei gave in Tokyo, and every month I would learn more. My Japanese would get a little better, and hearing something repeated for the 3rd time, I would finally get it, because if my mind flickered for a moment, I couldn't often catch up with the thread of the lecture. So it was hard work, and it was really worth it. I learned an unbelievable amount by putting that kind of work in. But you're right. Um, it was a sensitive issue within Aikido that other people studied with other teachers, because there's a tendency to just be part of, one tribe. Um, and it's so alien to us as Americans. I mean, everybody says, "Oh, I've got a guru, I've got a Tibetan teacher, I've got a this or that." But Japanese tend to be, in the past, I don't know now, but there's a tendency to be more sort of tribal. So I think that's partly why people didn't talk openly about Tempo Sensei. People would quietly talk to me about it. Anything else before? Yeah, Bob? You're muted.
There. Sorry, Sensei.
Much better. Much better.
Trying to unmute myself. You mentioned Feldenkrais.
Yeah.
You mentioned that from time to time, that name. Maybe in a future talk, you'll be able to tell us about your relationship with Feldenkrais?
Sure. I would be happy to. What many people don't know is Feldenkrais had a very deeply spiritual background. His father was a Hasidic mystic. And he himself, having, studied physics and mathematics, was very, very, he would joke about people believing in weird mystical things like ki or kundalini. And one of my colleagues who taught at Sophia was asking about kundalini. He said, "That's nonsense." And then he put her down on the sort of like massage table that he used to work on people, and he adjusted her spine, and she suddenly found this rush of kundalini running through her body, although he never admitted what he did. Or he had us begin to move our hands this way, and then begin to move our hands on our bodies to where we got much more sensitive about our own feeling and touch. And all of a sudden, everybody felt what felt like ki. But he gave a long 15-minute diatribe against ki that nobody knew what they were talking about before he did that, which I thought was hilarious. And I think part of the meaning was, don't talk about something if you don't understand it. But yeah, I'll make a note. Any other suggestions for future entertainment? Going once.
No, that was great. Thank you so much, Frager.
Oh, you're welcome. You're
Yes,
welcome.
I learned.
Thank you.
Yeah, great introduction.
Thank you.
Oh, good.
Yeah, he was he was brilliant. He was a great martial artist, and he had a huge impact on Aikido, which nobody talks about. I mean, Shohei did talk about it, but in a way that you either loved it or hated it. It was very divisive. So anyhow, thank you all.